Shabbos Daf Ayin Beis contains two distinct sections. The first half of the daf discusses how we apply all our explanations about when you realized that you did an Aveira, whether you have to bring one chatas or two chatas. How does that apply to Asham? If you realize between two Ashamais that you have to bring them, do you have to bring two or can you combine them to one? And the second half of the daf will discuss what is misasek and what is a shogeg. What is the level of making mistakes on Shabbos that you don't have to bring a carbon for at all because you didn't realize what you're doing. The Gemara there will have Machlokas Abaye and Rava and try to explain each one's source. The Gemara earlier on Daf Ayin Aleph had introduced us to a Machlokas between Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish as to when a person finds out after having committed multiple Averos that he did them, what separates those Averos into separate obligations for separate karbanos chatas. According to Rav Yochanan, finding out about them separately at separate stages means that they are separate karbanos. According to Reish Lakish, just finding out separately doesn't divide them. Perhaps if you separated karbanos between finding out about one and finding out about the other, that would divide them. Or if you actually brought a carbon, that might divide them. That would certainly divide them. But finding out separate times doesn't divide them into separate karbanos. According to Rav Yochanan, finding out separately does divide them. So according to Rav Yochanan, finding out, this is the bottom line which our Gemara will use. According to Rav Yochanan, finding out separately about averos that were committed that require chatos is the same as if you had already brought a carbon for the first one. If you found out about the first one, it's the same as if you had already brought a carbon about the first one. Now, when you find out about the second one, it's a separate obligation for a new carbon. Now the Gemara applies this to the halachos of bringing a carbon asham. Now, let's introduce a carbon asham. Asham is a different type of carbon that's brought for averos. There are two types of asham. An asham tali is brought somebody who thinks he's afraid he may owe a chatas and he's not sure. Then he brings something called an asham tali. If he later finds out that he did owe the chatas, he has to bring the chatas. Now, set that aside for now. An asham vadai is a carbon which is brought for an aveira, not a chatas. It's a different type. There are three types of averos which require an asham. One is if somebody used hektish materials by mistake. Another one is if somebody stole and swore falsely. And the third one, which is what we'll be focusing on the most, is called asham shivcha charufa. If somebody has relations with a shivcha kananis who is betrothed, who is nisares to an eved ivri. Okay, a shivcha kananis is allowed to marry an eved ivri. However, it doesn't count as a full-fledged marriage, and therefore somebody who intervenes and violates that marriage bond or that engagement isn't chayev like for a regular marriage that he interfered with. He only has to bring a carbon asham. Now, this carbon asham that he has to bring applies whether he committed this avera of being together with a shivcha charufa, whether he did it on purpose or he did it by mistake. That is unique about this particular carbon asham. Even if he did it on purpose, he knew fully what he was doing, who she was, what the avera is, and what the consequences are. He still has to bring a carbon asham. Now, what happens if a person were to violate this avera multiple times? Let's say he does 5 acts of bia together with a shivcha charufa. Is that one carbon for all of them, or is that separate karbanos? Now, if you think about it, what could possibly divide them up? He's chayev karbanos even if he knows what he's doing, even if he does it on purpose. So what could possibly divide them up? It's 5 different averas, but it should be all considered one thing. So if he did it on purpose, b'mezid, you're right, nothing divides them up. However, if he did it by mistake and he didn't realize what he was doing, it is possible that finding out about it separately will divide them up. How so? Because a asham may not work if you didn't know about the avera. Let's say you bring an asham and you're not sure you did the avera or not. You bring this asham vadi, you're not sure if you did the avera or not. So Rabbi Akiva says it doesn't work. It doesn't count. It only works if you knew that you did it for sure. Rabbi Tarfon says no, it works. You bring it as an asham taloi, and you say al tanai on the condition that I really had to bring the avera, it should be an asham vadai, and on the condition that I didn't have to, then it should be a asham tali, which is okay. So therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, that you couldn't bring an asham unless you knew that you had to, and if you brought one it didn't work, the knowledge, the realization that an act, that an avera was committed and a asham is owed is very significant. It divides up the separate averas into different things. So the Gemara therefore says as follows. According to Rabbi Tarfon, finding out that you owe an asham, that you did an avera which requires an asham, is totally insignificant. You can bring it whether you knew it or you didn't know about it, and therefore it doesn't matter when you find out or what you find out. You did the Isser of Shivcha Charufa 5 times, you only have to bring one carbon for all of them. According to Rabbi Kiva, however, and this is spelled out, the first half was spelled out by Ula, this is spelled out by Rav Dimi. According to Rabbi Akiva, however, if you find out between each action that you owed a separate avera, so then that is a new chiyuv carbon. That's a separate chiyuv carbon, and therefore you have to bring 5 separate karbanos. The finding out and the lacking knowledge divides it up into separate obligations to bring a carbon. Now, Rav Hamnuna here asked a question. He said, so I don't understand, what about if you actually brought the carbon in between? What would you say, according to Rabbi Tarfon, about that? It wouldn't divide it up? And the Gemara says, yes, no. If you brought the carbon in between each action, that would definitely divide it up. If somebody was together with a Shevcha Charufa and he brought a carbon and then he did it again, then you would need a new carbon. The last carbon doesn't count for that. However, Rabbi Tarfon, like we said, Rabbi Tarfon says, as if you together with Shevcha Charufa, by mistake, b'sheiging, then you found out about it, and then you did it again by mistake, so that those two would combine. The fact that you found that in between is insignificant, because even if you knew all along what you were doing, you're still chayiv karbanos for these. It doesn't matter what you knew and what you didn't know. According to Rabbi Kiva, however, the finding out in between divides it up into separate karbanos. Now the Gemara says, hold on a second. Let's apply Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish to this. Reish Lakish holds that finding out about things is not a significant thing. That only makes a difference in a case of a chatas, where you weren't chayiv a chatzah until you found out about it. Here, you were chayiv this asham anyway. You were chayiv the asham even before you found anything out. So, the fact that you found it out is really like Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish's case, where you found out in different times after the chayiv, after the avera was committed. After you performed the avera a few times, then you found out separately. So here, you're finding out separately, whether it's between the averas or not between the averas, doesn't really make a difference to your obligation to bring an asham. You have to bring an asham anyway. So why is that significant? So Gemara says that Rav Dimi wasn't bothered by this, and the reason is because he agreed to this. He said, you're right. According to Reish Lakish, this wouldn't be an issue. If a person does an avera with Shevcha Charufa, finds out, and then does it again by mistake, that wouldn't make a difference according to Reish Lakish, because according to Reish Lakish, finding out and finding out separately aren't significant. It's only according to Rav Yochanan that it's a problem, because Rav Yochanan, we said, holds that finding out is the same as actually bringing a carbon. If somebody has a few averos that require chatas, he eats a few pieces of chaylev, and then he finds out separately about each of them, so each finding out separates the chiyuv, because it's the finding out is like bringing a carbon. So according to him, this case would make sense. Finding out that he was together with a Shevcha Charufa and that he owes an asham would separate the chiyuvim, and then those would be separate chiyuvim. In summation, if a person was together with a Shevcha Charufa a few times, so when can they combine, when they cannot combine? So if, let's say he did it twice, if between the two violations he set aside his carbon or he brought the carbon, everybody would agree that that separates him into separate chiyuvim, and he needs a new carbon for the second avera. If, however, he just found out between the two cases, so then according to Rav Tarfon, there's definitely nothing to discuss, because finding out is totally insignificant. According to Rabbi Akiva, that finding out is significant, it would depend on the machlokas of Yochanan and Reish Lakish. According to Rav Yochanan, this finding out, which is significant, would separate the chiyuvim, just like it does by a carbon chatas when you find out after both averas were committed. And according to Reish Lakish, no, this finding out is not significant enough to separate the chiyuvim. You could bring one chatas for all of them. The Gemara now moves into a different, somewhat related subject, which is the issue of what is the definition of shoygeg and misasek as far as Hilchos Shabbos. So the halacha in Shabbos is that if you do something which is b'mezid, there's kares. If you do a shoygeg, it's chayav chatas. If you do misasek, you're parted completely. Misasek means that he didn't know what he was doing at all. So let's describe the levels here. We'll discuss 4 levels of understanding of what you're doing, and there'll be one which will be a machlokas Abaye and Rava. And the Gemara will try to find the source for Rava's opinion from a brisa, which will require a lot of explanation, and in the end we'll get to Rava's source. So first of all, as follows. If somebody cut a squash that was growing from the ground on purpose, knew what he was doing, knew it was usher, that's amazing. One level lighter than that is if somebody cut the squash from the ground, he knew he was cutting squash from the ground, but he didn't know that that was usher. Or he knew it was usher, and he didn't know that today was Shabbos, so he thought that it wasn't usher for that reason. That's a shogeg, that's what you bring a chatas for. Skip a level, the opposite end of the spectrum, somebody who was just trying to pick up a knife that was lying on the ground, and it happened to slice through a cucumber. That was not what he was intending to do. He wasn't intending to cut. He was just intending to lift. The action he was doing was not related in any way to an isser. He was just lifting, not cutting. It's a different way of describing the action. That's called misasik. He's not chayav anything at all. Machlokes Abaye and Rava is between shogeg and misasik, and that's if somebody intended to cut, but he didn't intend to cut something that was attached. Okay, so somebody was slicing a cucumber in his garden. He was slicing a detached cucumber in his garden, and his knife happened to strike an attached cucumber and slice that off the ground as well. So this is Machlokes Abaye and Rava. Abaye says since his intention was cutting, and his malacha was cutting, so he's that's a chayav chatas. That's called a shogeg. He knew what he was doing. He was cutting, and he was even cutting cucumbers in the case that we discussed. He wasn't planning to cut one that was attached to the ground. Okay, that's still called a chayav chatas. Rava says no, that counts as misasik. He wasn't intending to do this malacha at all. What he was intending to do was cut, but not malacha, not the action of malacha, which is cutting something attached to the ground. So therefore, that's called masasik as well. Now the Gemara looks for Rava's source. Rava says, my source is from the following brisa. The Gemara quotes a lengthy brisa, which will be a little difficult to understand. We'll try to understand the brisa, and at the end we'll get to Rava's source and why Abaye rejects it. The brisa says as follows. There's a way where Shabbos is stricter than other mitzvahs, and there's a way in which other mitzvahs are stricter than Shabbos. How so? Shabbos is stricter than other mitzvahs, and if you do a malacha, if you do two malachas, you have to bring two karbanos. Other mitzvahs, if you violate two, you only have to bring one carbon. Now, Shabbos, in a sense, is more lenient than other mitzvahs because misasik, if you do something which the Gemara calls shogeg b'lo miskavin, you did it by mistake without even knowing what you were doing at all, which is similar to what we're describing. The Gemara will say this is the level that Abaye and Rava were arguing about. So this level where he didn't know what he was doing, it's not actual masasik because he did the action, but he did cutting, but he didn't know exactly that he was cutting something that's attached to the ground. So he didn't know what he was doing. So in that, in Shabbos one is not chayav to bring a carbon, but in other mitzvahs one is chayav to bring a carbon. Now, the Gemara ultimately will say that this is Rava's source. Because Rava says that you see here clearly that in the situation of shogeg b'lo miskavin, he didn't know what he was doing, and he's not chayav to bring a carbon. That must be a case, like we said. That's a case of where somebody cut it. He was cutting cucumbers, and he accidentally cut one that was attached to the ground, and he didn't realize. That must be what the Gemara means, that you are pater in Hilchos Shabbos, but in other Yisurim you're chayav. So, for example, if somebody was eating fat from an animal, and he accidentally ate a piece of chaylev. He didn't realize that he was eating a chaylev. He thought he was eating kosher. So that would be the same thing. He was eating. He was doing an act of eating, and he didn't realize you're chayav chatzos for that anyway. So that would be what the brisa means, that for Shabbos, in that case, you're not chayav, and for other averos you are chayav, and that's my source. And brisa says, no, that's not what the brisa was referring to. The brisa is referring to where you're doing a different action altogether. So in the case of chaylev, you were just trying to swallow some saliva. You weren't eating at all. And you actually had some forbidden liquefied chaylev in your mouth. You didn't realize. So you were eating without even realizing you were eating. You weren't intending to do an act of eating. You were intending to do an act of swallowing saliva. That's not called eating. In the case of Shabbos, that's similar to that, is where you were intending to just pick up a knife. You weren't doing cutting. You were doing lifting. And you happened to cut. So that's what it's referring to. That's how Abaye understands the brisa, and that's why he doesn't think it's a source. Now, before the Gemara gets to all that, the Gemara has to explain the brisa step by step. So let's see. First of all, the first thing that the brisa said was that on Shabbos it's separate chatos for separate averos, and in other mitzvahs it's one chatos for many averos. And where it says, what could this be? If we're talking about separate malachos, like cutting and grinding, so then in other mitzvahs, the comparable thing would be if he ate chaylev and he ate blood. But for that, you have to bring 2 chatas. It's not 1 chatas. And if it's referring to where it's only one, where he ate chaylev and he ate chaylev 2 separate times, so in Shabbos that would be that he cut and he cut, so you would only bring 1 chatas for that. So what's this referring to? So Gemara says it's referring to Shabbos versus Avodah Zarah, not Shabbos versus all mitzvahs, but Shabbos versus Avodah Zarah. The halacha is that if somebody does many different acts of worship of an Avodah Zarah, like he slaughters an animal and he brings the blood and he bows, all these things the same Avodah Zarah, that only counts as 1 chatas. On the other hand, as far as Shabbos is concerned, if you do separate malachos, those are 2 separate chatas. So now the Gemara says, hold on a second. If when we say other mitzvahs referring to Avodah Zarah, then how do you understand the end of the brisa? The end of the brisa said that if he violates halach and he doesn't realize what he's doing, it's shagig b'lei miskavin, which is where Rava had his proof from. So if that's referring to Avodah Zarah, so then what's the situation in which a person is chayav to bring a carbon chatas for a shagig b'lei miskavin? How does that work? And the Gemara will try a few different steps here. So the Gemara first says maybe what it's referring to is that he saw a shul, he thought it was a shul, he went in, he bowed down, but it was really a house of idol worship. So the Gemara says doesn't have to bring a chatas for that. He was bowing down to Hashem, he happened to be in front of an idol, but that's not what he was doing, he wasn't worshiping the idol at all, doesn't have to bring a chatas. Okay, so maybe it'll tell me that he was bowing to a statue of the king or something. So the Gemara says, but that doesn't make sense. What's the case? He thought the king was a god and he was worshipping it, so then that's amazing. That's not a chatas. That's not a shagig at all. Maybe it'll tell me that he was just honoring the king. So then that's not Avodah Zarah. There's no Avodah Zarah there. He was bowing to the king to show honor. That's not Avodah Zarah in the slightest. So the Gemara says, okay, we'll try another approach here. Maybe what happened was that he was bowing to an idol, but not because he was worshiping the idol, but because he was afraid of somebody or he loved somebody and that motivated him to bow to this idol, but he really didn't have any worship to the idol, he was just doing it. And he thought that that's permitted. Well, in fact, it's asur. It's forbidden. So Gemara says, that can't be, because that itself is a machlekes Abaye and Rava. And Abaye says that in such a case he's chayiv chatas, but Rava says he's not. So then how would Rava explain the brisa? So we still are left without an explanation. So the Gemara says, okay, maybe it'll tell me that the guy thought that it was permitted to worship idols. He thought that Avodah Zarah was mutter. So the Gemara said, so then how could you tell me that if he would do such a thing in Hilchos Shabbos, he wouldn't have to bring a chatas? That means a guy performed a malacha on Shabbos and didn't know that it was asur. So for sure he has to bring a chatas for that. We had some discussion earlier, if he didn't know it was Shabbos and he didn't know that it was asur, do you have to bring a chatas or not? But if he knew it was Shabbos and he forgot that it was asur, so then for sure he has to bring. So that can't be it either. So Gemara says, you're right. The second half of the brisa is not talking about Avodah Zarah. When it says other mitzvahs, you do not have to bring a carbon chatas for a shagig b'lei miskavein. It's not referring to Avodah Zarah. The first half of the brisa is referring to Avodah Zarah, the second half is not. And that's therefore referring to when you eat 2 pieces, when you ate chaylev and you thought you were eating kosher, you didn't realize that there was a chaylev in there. And that's where Rava gets his proof from in Abaye's rejection, as we said before.